The moment that changed everything's story begins on a warm afternoon in Los Angeles, the kind of day that feels almost too bright, too calm, as if something important is silently waiting to happen. Keanu Reeves was walking slowly across the parking lot of a quiet studio, carrying a small notebook in one hand and a sense of uncertainty in the other. For years, he had kept his feelings hidden deep within himself, locked behind layers of humility, fear, and the belief that some truths were better left unspoken. He had always been a man who valued peace over chaos, silence over unnecessary noise, and kindness over anything that could cause harm. But on this day, he felt something unusual stirring inside him, something that refused to remain quiet any longer. Sandra Bullock was already inside the building, sitting at a long wooden table in a rehearsal room that still smelled faintly like paint. She had arrived early, as she always did, because she liked to take her time settling into her thoughts before facing people. Sandra had a way of moving with confidence and vulnerability at the same time, a rare balance she carried naturally. She had spent years building a strong exterior, yet inside she held a softness that only a few people truly understood. She had loved and lost, risen and fallen, and grown through every quiet storm life had handed her. She knew how to smile even when it hurt, and how to keep going when others might have stopped. The two of them had worked together before, many years earlier, and their connection had always felt effortless, almost too easy, as if they had known each other long before their first meeting. The chemistry they shared on screen had surprised many people, but what most didn't know was how real and deep the connection felt behind the scenes, too. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't filled with big romantic gestures or wild revelations. It was something quieter, simpler, something built through gentle laughter, shared respect, and small moments that meant more than either of them had ever shown. Both of them had sensed something powerful back then, but life had its own timings, its own obstacles, and they were both carrying different burdens that prevented them from exploring what that connection might have been. Years had passed. They had grown, changed, healed, and learned. Yet the connection never disappeared. It remained like an invisible thread between them, something that stayed even when they moved in different directions. And now, as they prepared for a new project that had brought them back together, the feelings they had once hidden were slowly rising to the surface again, asking to be acknowledged. Keanu entered the room quietly, as he always did, his steps gentle, almost hesitant. He saw Sandra sitting there, reading a script, her hair falling loosely over her shoulder. The afternoon sunlight was pouring through the tall windows behind her, surrounding her in a warm glow that made her look almost unreal for a moment. Keanu froze mid-step without realizing it. He had always admired her, not just for her talent or her presence, but for the kindness she carried so naturally, the sort of kindness that made people feel safe. And in that moment, he knew deep down that he could no longer run from the truth he had been avoiding for so long. Sandra looked up, surprised but happy to see him. "Hey," she said softly, her voice warm enough to make the room feel even brighter. "You made it before the director this time." Keanu smiled, a small but genuine smile that he rarely showed unless he truly felt it. "Yeah, I thought I'd try something new today." She laughed lightly, and that sound alone made him feel something settle peacefully inside his chest. For a moment, the world felt simple. But he knew that wouldn't last long, not today, because today he had come with a purpose he could no longer ignore. They sat across from each other, scripts open, but neither of them truly focused on the words in front of them. There was something in the air between them, a quiet heaviness, like a question waiting to be asked. Sandra felt it too, though she didn't know yet what it meant. She only knew that Keanu seemed different today, more thoughtful, more distant, as if he was standing on the edge of something he wasn't sure how to face. After a few minutes, she tilted her head slightly and asked, "You okay? You seem like you're somewhere else." He hesitated, staring at the pages of his script even though he wasn't reading a single word. The truth was building inside him, pushing harder and harder, and he knew he couldn't hold it back much longer. He took a slow breath, the kind of breath someone takes right before revealing something that has lived inside them for years. "Sandra," he began softly, and she felt a shift in the room the moment he spoke her name like that. "There's something I need to tell you, something I should have said a long time ago." Her heartbeat quickened, though she didn't show it. She leaned in slightly, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "What is it?" she asked gently. Keanu's eyes lowered to the table for a moment. He could feel the weight of years pressing down on him, years of silence, years of missed chances, years of convincing himself he didn't deserve to say anything. But now, seeing her sitting across from him again, he realized that if he stayed quiet even one more day, he would regret it for the rest of his life. When he finally looked up, his voice trembled just enough to reveal the truth he had never shown to anyone. "I cared about you," he said quietly, "more than I ever admitted, more than I ever let myself admit." Sandra's breath caught in her throat. She didn't move, didn't blink. The room felt completely still. Even the sunlight seemed to pause. Keanu continued before fear could stop him. "Back then, during the movie, and even after, I cared about you in a way that went beyond friendship. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to make things complicated for you. I didn't want to put pressure on you. And honestly," he swallowed hard, "I didn't think I deserved to say it." Sandra slowly set her script down, her hands trembling slightly. She had never expected to hear these words from him, not after so many years, not spoken with such honesty and vulnerability. She had always known that there was something special between them, but she had never imagined he had been carrying this level of emotion all along. "Keanu," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. But he wasn't finished. "I'm not telling you this to change anything or ask for anything," he said quickly, afraid she might misunderstand. "I just needed to be honest, finally, because it's been inside me all this time and I can't keep pretending it wasn't real." The words hung in the air like a fragile truth, delicate but deeply powerful. Sandra felt her heart twist in ways she couldn't control. She had spent years wondering about him, about the unspoken moments they had shared, about the strange and beautiful connection that had always existed between them. She had admired him, cared for him, felt drawn to him in ways she couldn't explain, but life had taken them in different directions. She had convinced herself it was just timing, just circumstance, just the universe keeping them apart for reasons she didn't fully understand. Now, hearing his confession, all the memories she had tried to tuck away came rushing back like a wave she couldn't stop. The late-night conversations on set. The shared jokes that no one else understood. The way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention. The gentle respect he always showed her, even when he didn't have to. She had felt something too. She had simply been too afraid to admit it. But now, sitting across from him with the truth laid bare between them, she felt something inside her shifting, opening, breaking, rebuilding. She wasn't sure what it meant yet, but she knew this moment had changed everything. Keanu watched her carefully, quietly, respectfully. He didn't reach for her or try to force a reaction. He simply waited, allowing her the space to feel whatever she needed to feel. That was who he was, gentle, patient, humble, and deeply respectful. After a long silence, Sandra finally met his eyes again. There was warmth in her gaze, but also confusion, longing, and a sense of fear she couldn't hide. "I don't know what to say," she admitted softly. He nodded, understanding completely. "You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know." She could feel her eyes growing warm with emotion, though she kept her voice steady. "Why now?" she asked quietly. Keanu looked down for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "Because we're here again," he said softly. "Because being in the same room as you brings everything back. Because I realize that I've spent years hiding from my feelings and I'm tired of being afraid of the truth." Sandra felt a subtle ache in her chest at his words. There was something painfully honest about them, something that made her want to reach across the table and hold his hand. But she didn't move. She couldn't, not yet. She wasn't sure what she felt, or maybe she was afraid to admit it to herself. Emotions were rising inside her too quickly, too strongly, and she didn't want to say something she wasn't ready to say. Before she could respond, the door opened and one of the production assistants walked in. "Hey, sorry to interrupt," the assistant said casually. "The director's running late. He asked if you two could review scene 3 while you wait." The assistant left just as quickly as they had entered, unaware of the fragile moment they had disrupted. Keanu and Sandra sat in silence, both of them startled back into the reality of the room. But the truth didn't disappear. It stayed between them, powerful and undeniable, filling the space more than any script ever could. Sandra took a slow breath, trying to steady her emotions. "We should go over the scene," she said softly, though her voice was unsteady. Keanu nodded gently. "Yeah, okay." But neither of them opened their scripts. The room felt heavier than before, filled with a quiet intensity neither of them knew how to handle yet. Sandra kept glancing at him, feeling her heart race every time she remembered his words. Keanu sat there with a subtle sadness in his eyes, but also a sense of relief. as if a weight had finally been lifted. After several long minutes, Sandra finally spoke again, her voice softer than before. "Keanu, I need time to think." He nodded, grateful she was being honest. "Of course, take all the time you need. I didn't tell you any of this to make things harder for you." She looked down, her fingers lightly brushing the edges of the script pages. "You didn't make it harder," she murmured. "You just made it real." Keanu felt something shift in him, something that hurt but also felt strangely hopeful. He had expected rejection, fear, or even anger, but instead she had given him honesty. That alone meant more to him than he could express. Just as Sandra began to speak again, the door opened once more, and this time the person who entered the room was someone neither of them expected. Their faces shifted instantly. The moment was shattered, and everything was about to become far more complicated than either of them was prepared for. The interruption that changed everything, the door opened slowly, almost too casually, but the impact it had on the room was immediate and heavy. Keanu and Sandra both turned their heads at the same time, their eyes widening with surprise as a familiar figure stepped inside. It was Jonathan Hale, the film's producer, a man known for his sharp instincts, subtle authority, and a habit of appearing at the most unexpected moments. He carried a folder under his arm and wore an expression that suggested he had walked in on something important, though he didn't yet understand what it was. Jonathan looked between the two actors, sensing the tension lingering in the air. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything," he said lightly, though his tone had a faint edge of curiosity. Keanu straightened slightly in his chair, trying to mask the raw vulnerability still visible in his eyes. Sandra sat a little too still, her hands resting on the closed script in front of her. Neither of them spoke right away, their silence speaking louder than any words could. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Okay, I definitely walked into something." Sandra forced a small smile, though her voice didn't match the expression. "We were just talking." Keanu didn't add anything. He couldn't. Not now. The truth he had confessed just moments earlier still hung between them like a fragile thread, and the last thing he wanted was for someone else to tug on it. Jonathan didn't press, at least not directly. He placed the folder on the table and leaned against the edge, watching the two actors with a mix of curiosity and concern. "I wanted to check in before the director gets here," he said. "There are a few changes to the schedule. Filming might shift around a bit over the next few weeks. I figured you both should know early." Normally, Sandra would have asked questions, taken notes, or made lighthearted jokes about schedule chaos. But right now, she couldn't focus on anything except the echo of Keanu's confession and the uncertainty swirling inside her. She nodded mechanically, though she hardly processed the words. Jonathan noticed her distraction. "Everything all right?" he asked gently. She hesitated. "Yeah, just thinking about a few things." Keanu glanced at her for a brief moment, a quiet acknowledgement of the truth they were both silently navigating. But he didn't hold her gaze. He didn't want to overwhelm her, not when she was already processing so much. Jonathan cleared his throat softly. "Well, the two of you are the heart of this film. If anything comes up, or if either of you needs adjustments, we'll work around it." Sandra nodded again. Keanu simply murmured, "Thanks." The producer pushed off the table and moved toward the door. But just before leaving, he paused and looked back at them with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said carefully, "some connections between actors are rare. When they're real, they make the entire project stronger. So if something's on your mind, personally or professionally, don't ignore it. It always finds its way into the work." The words lingered long after he left, as if he had sensed far more than he admitted. Once the door clicked shut, the silence returned, thicker than before, heavier with everything unsaid. Sandra exhaled slowly, as if releasing a breath she had been holding for too long. Keanu's fingers tapped gently on the table, small nervous movements he couldn't quite control. Sandra finally looked at him, though her eyes were filled with confusion, warmth, fear, and something else, something neither of them was ready to name. "He didn't know," she said softly, almost to reassure herself. Keanu nodded. "I know." She stared at her script, not seeing a single word. "Keanu, what you said earlier, I haven't stopped thinking about it." His heartbeat quickened, though he remained completely still. "I figured." She hesitated again, her voice trembling lightly. "It's not that I don't care. I do, a lot more than I've ever said out loud. But hearing you say it like that, it's a lot." He nodded gently, his voice low and understanding. I didn't mean to overwhelm you. You didn't, she whispered. You just opened a door I didn't expect to open today. He understood that feeling all too well. For years, he had kept that door sealed shut, convinced that opening it would only cause pain or confusion. But now, seeing her struggle with the very truth he had feared, he realized how complicated emotions could become when two people had spent years hiding them. After a long pause, Sandra leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment. The room felt too bright, too quiet, too full of memories she had buried deep inside herself. Do you ever feel like life has this strange way of circling back to people or moments you weren't ready for? She asked suddenly. Keanu looked at her with gentle surprise. Every day, he admitted softly. She opened her eyes again and met his gaze. That's what this feels like something unfinished suddenly came back. Keanu swallowed, his voice barely audible. Does that scare you? She nodded slowly. A little, but not because it's wrong, just because it's real. Those words hit him deeper than he expected. He had prepared himself for rejection, confusion, anger, or even distant politeness. But this honest vulnerability was something he hadn't dared to hope for. Sandra wasn't pushing him away. She wasn't shutting down. She wasn't pretending it didn't matter. She was simply overwhelmed. And that felt far more meaningful than anything he could have imagined. Before either of them could say anything else, their phones buzzed at the same time. A message from the director. Running late, rehearsal postponed. Go home and rest. We'll start fresh tomorrow. Sandra sighed quietly, relieved and disappointed at the same time. Keanu stared at his phone for a moment, then looked at her. Do you want to stay and talk? He asked carefully. She froze. He noticed immediately and added softly, only if you want to. Sandra took several seconds before responding. She placed her script back into her bag, her fingers trembling slightly. I think I need some time alone, she said gently. Not forever, just to breathe, to understand what I feel, to understand what this means. Keanu nodded, accepting her need for space with the same respect he had always shown her. I get it, he said quietly. She stood slowly, her movements hesitant, as if she was still carrying the weight of the moment on her shoulders. Keanu rose as well, standing a few steps away from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply looked at each other, both aware that the dynamic between them had changed forever. Sandra reached for the door but paused before opening it. She turned back to him, her expression soft, conflicted, but undeniably sincere. Keanu, thank you for telling me the truth, even if I don't know what to do with it yet. He smiled gently, a small, humble smile filled with gratitude. Take your time, I'm not going anywhere. Her eyes glimmered with something emotional, something that felt close to relief. She opened the door and stepped out, leaving him alone in the quiet rehearsal room with nothing but his thoughts, his fears, and a fragile sense of hope that refused to fade. When Sandra walked down the hallway, her mind was spinning with memories she had avoided for years. She remembered the laughter they shared on set, the way he always stood up for her without making a show of it, the nights they talked about life quietly, the little moments that felt too intimate to mention. Back then, she had sensed he cared, but she had convinced herself it was better not to explore it. She was dealing with her own struggles, her own uncertainty, and she didn't think she could offer him anything real at the time. But now everything felt different, older, deeper, more honest. She drove home slowly, replaying his words over and over again. I cared about you more than I ever admitted. Those words hit her with a force she didn't expect. They weren't dramatic. They weren't poetic. They were simple, gentle, honest, just like him. That made them even more powerful. Meanwhile, Keanu sat alone in the quiet studio room for several more minutes. He felt relieved, anxious, hopeful, and terrified all at once. He had spent years carrying a truth that had quietly shaped him, guided him, and haunted him. Saying it out loud felt like taking the first real breath in a long time. But now he didn't know what would happen next. He didn't want to lose her. He didn't want to overwhelm her, but he couldn't pretend anymore. After nearly 20 minutes, he finally gathered his things and walked out into the hallway. The studio was unusually empty, its silence almost comforting. He walked slowly toward the exit, unsure of everything except one thing. He had done the right thing, even if it scared him. That night, both of them lay awake in their separate homes, unable to sleep, unable to silence the rush of emotions filling their minds. Sandra kept replaying every moment from the rehearsal room, every expression on his face, every quiet word he spoke with so much honesty. Keanu kept imagining her reaction, wondering what she was feeling, hoping he hadn't caused her pain. But while they were both drowning in thoughts, the universe was quietly preparing something neither of them expected. The next morning would bring a new twist, a new complication, and a new moment that would change everything again. Because when Sandra walked onto the set the next day, she wasn't alone. And the person walking beside her was someone from her past, someone whose presence would shift everything Keanu thought he understood. Someone who would challenge the fragile truth they had just begun to face. And the moment Keanu saw them together, his heart sank in a way he wasn't prepared for. The return of someone she once loved. Keanu arrived early the next morning, long before anyone else, because he needed the quiet. He needed the stillness of the empty set, the soft hum of distant lights, the silence that let him breathe. Sleep had been impossible for him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sandra's face, the way her expression shifted between surprise, confusion, and a strange tenderness she hadn't tried to hide. He knew she cared for him on some level, but he also knew she was overwhelmed. He didn't blame her. He had dropped years of emotion onto her all at once because he had finally lost the ability to hold them inside. The air felt cool inside the studio, a slight chill that made the room feel larger than it was. Keanu set his bag down and walked to the center of the stage where the scene markers were taped. He stood there quietly, imagining how the day would unfold, trying to prepare himself for whatever came next. But no amount of preparation could shield him from the moment that was about to happen. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. He turned instinctively when he heard Sandra's voice in the distance. She was laughing softly, the kind of laugh she used when she was trying to hide nervousness behind warmth. For a split second, he felt relieved. Maybe she had slept better than he had. Maybe she had found clarity. Maybe she had come ready to talk. But then he heard another voice beside hers, a man's voice. A familiar one. Keanu's body froze the moment they stepped into the room. Sandra walked in first, her eyes bright but cautious, her posture a mixture of confidence and hidden tension. Right beside her was Michael Anderson, her ex-partner from years ago, a man she had once cared about deeply, someone she trusted long before life took them in different directions. Michael had worked in the industry too, though not as an actor. He was known for his calm presence, his easy smile, and the stability he once brought into Sandra's life during a time when she needed grounding. Seeing them together now felt like a quiet punch to Keanu's chest, not because he distrusted her, but because he suddenly realized how fragile yesterday's moment had been. He had confessed something enormous, something that had lived inside him for years, and he knew she needed space. He had respected that, but he hadn't expected her to walk in this morning with someone from her past, someone whose presence might pull her backward into old memories she had once held close. The room filled with a strange silence as soon as they entered. Sandra saw Keanu standing near the center of the stage, and for a moment her smile softened. She looked like she wanted to say something to him, something gentle, something meaningful. But Michael, unaware of the emotional storm between them, stepped forward with an easy grin. "Keanu Reeves," Michael said warmly. "It's been a long time." Keanu forced a polite smile. "Yeah, it has." Michael extended a hand and Keanu shook it out of courtesy. But inside, he felt something twisting painfully. He didn't want to be jealous. He didn't want to feel threatened. He respected Sandra too much to make assumptions. But emotions weren't always logical, and his heart was reacting faster than his mind could control. Sandra watched them carefully, sensing the tension she hoped wouldn't appear. She had invited Michael onto the set only because he happened to be in town for a short visit and wanted to catch up. She hadn't expected the timing to collide like this, not after the confession she had received the day before. She hadn't even processed her own feelings fully yet. She wasn't trying to hurt Keanu, and the thought that he might feel something painful because of this made her chest tighten with guilt. Michael looked around the set with admiration. "This film is going to be incredible," he said. "I'm excited to see you both work together again. The whole world loves the two of you." Keanu nodded silently. Sandra offered a gentle smile, but her mind wasn't on Michael's words. She kept glancing at Keanu, searching his expression, trying to understand how deeply her unexpected arrival had affected him. She saw a softness in his eyes, but also a quiet hurt he was trying to hide. He hid his emotions with grace, but she knew him well enough to notice when something troubled him. Michael, unaware of the emotional undercurrents, continued talking. "I was telling Sandra earlier, Some connections between people stay strong no matter how many years pass. I used to see that between you two even back then. Keanu felt his heart tighten again. The irony was too sharp. Sandra felt a sudden rush of anxiety. She knew Michael wasn't trying to complicate things. He was simply speaking honestly. But the timing, the tone, the weight of yesterday's confession, everything felt tangled now. Finally, she gently touched Michael's arm. "Hey, would you mind giving me a moment? I need to talk to Keanu before rehearsal starts." Michael smiled kindly. "Of course, take your time." He walked toward the back of the studio to chat with a crew member, leaving Sandra and Keanu standing a few feet apart in a silence that felt too heavy to ignore. Sandra stepped closer, her voice soft and careful. "Keanu, I didn't expect this. Michael and I are anything, not anymore. He was just in town. I didn't bring him here to—" Keanu gently shook his head before she could finish. "You don't owe me an explanation." But his voice, though calm, held a quiet sadness that made her heart ache. She took another step toward him, her expression filled with sincerity. "I didn't want to hurt you." He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze fragile but understanding. "You didn't, I just wasn't expecting it." Sandra nodded slowly. "Neither was I." Their eyes locked for a moment that felt vulnerable, powerful, and painfully honest. Sandra wanted to say more, wanted to explain the chaos inside her, but before she could speak, the assistant director approached them. "We're getting ready to start," he said. "We'll begin with scene 7. Sandra and Keanu exchanged a look, one filled with everything they couldn't yet say, before stepping toward their marks on the stage. The strange thing about acting with someone you have deep, real emotions for is that the line between character and self becomes dangerously thin. Their scene that morning was supposed to be emotional, raw, filled with unspoken tension. But for the first time in years, acting felt too close to reality. As the cameras rolled, Keanu stood across from Sandra, his character needing to confess something while hers struggled with her own truth. The scene demanded vulnerability, eye contact, hesitation, longing, everything they were already drowning in. The director didn't plan it this way, but life had aligned the moment too perfectly. Keanu looked at her with the same softness he had shown the day before, and Sandra felt herself slipping into something real, not scripted. Her breath shook slightly, and when she delivered her lines, they came out warmer than she intended. Too honest, too emotional, too close to the truth she was still afraid to face. When the scene ended, the room fell silent. The director stared at them with amazement. "That was incredible," he said slowly. "I've never seen anything so real." Keanu didn't look away from Sandra. Sandra didn't look away from him. The director clapped his hands once. "Take 5. The moment the break was announced, Sandra stepped away quickly, overwhelmed. She didn't walk far. She just needed a small corner to breathe, to make sense of everything happening at once. Keanu stayed where he was, trying to steady himself. The way she looked at him during the scene, it wasn't acting. He knew it, and she knew it. But he also understood how complicated everything had become with Michael's presence. The break room door opened softly behind Sandra, but she didn't need to turn around to know it was Michael. She recognized his footsteps. He approached her with controlled concern. "Hey," he said gently, "you okay? You seemed emotional in that scene." Sandra tensed for a moment before forcing a soft smile. "Just acting, long night." Michael nodded, though he didn't fully believe her. "I know that look," he said quietly. "I've seen it before, it's not just acting." She didn't answer. He sighed, looking at her with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. "Is it him?" The question hit her harder than she expected. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Instead, she felt a rush of fear, confusion, and something painfully honest rising in her chest. Michael nodded again, more gently this time. "It's okay. You don't have to explain. It's written all over you." Sandra's eyes softened with guilt. "I never wanted you to be caught in the middle of—" He lifted a hand, stopping her kindly. "You're not hurting me. I moved on long ago. I just want you to be honest with yourself." She swallowed, her voice trembling. "I don't even know what I feel." Michael offered a small, understanding smile. "Yes, you do. You're just scared to admit it." Those words shook her to her core. Meanwhile, across the room, Keanu watched the two of them speaking quietly. His chest tightened again, not out of jealousy this time, but fear. Fear that she might walk away from him emotionally, fear that his confession had arrived too late, fear that the universe had brought them back together only to test them. As he watched her brush a strand of hair behind her ear while she spoke to Michael, something inside him cracked painfully. He looked away, trying to steady his breath, but the ache in his chest refused to fade. Finally, Sandra stepped away from Michael and began walking toward Keanu with determination, her heart pounding, her mind racing. But just a few steps before she reached him, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and immediately froze. Keanu saw the change in her expression, the sudden fear, the way her entire body stiffened. "Sandra," he asked softly. She answered the call, her voice barely steady. "Hello." There was silence, followed by a faint breath from the other end. Then a trembling voice spoke, and Sandra's face drained of all color. She whispered what happened. Her hand shook so hard the phone nearly slipped. Keanu stepped closer, alarmed. "Sandra, what is it?" She slowly lowered the phone, her eyes wide with shock and heartbreak. "It's my sister," she whispered. "She's in the hospital." Keanu froze. And in that moment, everything shifted again. The call that broke her calm for several seconds after Sandra spoke the words. The world around her seemed to dissolve into silence. The bustling studio, the lights humming softly overhead, the distant conversations of crew members, everything faded until all she could hear was the echo of her sister's name repeating endlessly inside her mind. Her breath became shallow, and her fingers tightened around her phone so hard that her knuckles turned pale. Her heart pounded violently inside her chest, not in a fast rhythm, but in a heavy, shaking one, like each beat carried a different fear. Keanu stepped toward her slowly, as if afraid that any sudden movement might break her completely. "Sandra," he said softly, his voice low, warm, gentle, the kind of voice someone uses when they are trying not to cause more pain. "What happened?" Sandra swallowed hard. She collapsed. Her voice cracked as she spoke, the fear she was trying to suppress creeping through every syllable. "They don't know what caused it yet." Keanu's heart tightened painfully. He knew how deeply Sandra loved her sister. He had seen the way she talked about her, the way she defended her, cherished her, and worried for her. Her family meant everything to her. And now, with one sudden phone call, her world had been thrown into chaos. "Do you need to go to her?" Keanu asked gently, though he already knew the answer. "Yes," Sandra whispered. "I need to go now." She grabbed her bag with trembling hands. Keanu reached out instinctively, steadying her arm before she could rush off blindly. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with panic, confusion, and a kind of raw vulnerability he had rarely seen from her before. "I'll take you," he said without hesitation. She blinked at him. "You don't have to." "I'm not letting you go alone," he said softly but firmly. The certainty in his voice hit her deeply. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about the confession he had made yesterday. He wasn't thinking about Michael or the complicated emotions swirling between them. He was simply thinking of her, her fear, her pain, her need. She nodded, unable to speak. When she turned to walk, her legs felt weak, as though her entire body had been drained of strength. Keanu stayed close, his presence steadying her without being invasive. The crew members parted quietly as the two of them walked toward the exit. They didn't ask questions. They could see the look on Sandra's face, and that alone was enough. Michael watched from a distance, worry etched into his features. Sandra gave him a quick, apologetic glance. He nodded back silently, understanding that there were moments in life when emotions, history, and confusion didn't matter. Family did. The drive to the hospital felt longer than it was. Sandra stared out the window, her eyes unfocused, her thoughts tangled in fear. Keanu drove with careful attention, his hands steady on the wheel, his heart aching for her. He wanted to say something comforting, but he understood that sometimes silence was gentler than words. After several minutes, Sandra spoke in a broken whisper. "We weren't on good terms." Keanu glanced at her, concern deepening. "You and your sister." She nodded slowly. "We had an argument a few weeks ago, something stupid, something small, but I let it grow bigger. I thought there would be time to fix it later." Her voice cracked again, and she pressed her trembling fingers against her lips as tears welled in her eyes. "What if I don't get that chance now?" Keanu felt his chest tighten painfully. "You will," he said softly, even though he had no way of knowing. "You're going to see her now, that's what matters." Sandra wiped her eyes with her sleeve, trying to steady herself. "What if she doesn't want to see me?" She loves you, Keanu said gently. Nothing erases that. She looked at him, surprised by the certainty in his tone. How can you be so sure? Because I've seen you talk about her, he replied. You talk about her the way people talk about someone who shaped their life, and I'm sure she feels the same about you. A fight doesn't break that. Sandra's shoulders trembled. Her breathing grew unsteady again. Keanu reached over and placed a hand gently on hers, not to claim anything, not because of what he confessed, but because she needed someone to hold on to. She didn't pull away. They drove the rest of the way in silence, but the kind of silence that wasn't empty. It was filled with understanding, compassion, and the unspoken bond that had grown between them over the years. When they finally reached the hospital, Sandra practically ran toward the entrance. Keanu followed quickly, staying close but not pushing himself into her personal space. He wanted to be there for her, but he also wanted to respect her need to process everything. They approached the reception desk and Sandra's voice trembled as she spoke. My sister. She was brought in earlier. Her name is Leela. The nurse checked her screen, nodded, and gestured toward the elevator. Room 412. Her condition is stable for now. Sandra's knees nearly buckled with relief. Thank you, she whispered before rushing toward the elevator. Keanu stepped into the elevator with her, standing quietly beside her as she held onto the railing with trembling hands. The doors closed, sealing them into a small, tense space where her anxiety seemed almost too big to contain. When they reached the 4th floor, Sandra stepped out quickly, her heartbeat pounding loudly in her ears. She walked fast, then faster until she reached the room number. She froze at the door. Keanu stopped beside her. You got this, he said softly. She swallowed hard, wiped her eyes again, and slowly pushed the door open. Inside, Leela lay on the bed, pale and still, her hair spread across the pillow. Machines beeped softly around her. Her breathing was steady but weak, the kind of breath that comes from exhaustion or illness. Sandra felt her entire body tighten with emotion. She stepped inside slowly, almost afraid to get too close. Leela, she whispered shakily. Leela opened her eyes, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. San, she breathed, her voice soft and tired. Sandra's lips trembled. She covered her mouth with her hand as tears broke free without warning. Oh my God, she whispered. Leela. Leela's eyes softened. You came. Those 2 words shattered Sandra completely. She rushed to the bedside, grabbed her sister's hand, and held it tightly. Of course I came. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Leela squeezed her hand weakly. We're okay, she whispered. I'm okay. Sandra shook her head as tears dripped onto their joined hands. I should have called. I should have fixed things sooner. I was stupid. Leela smiled faintly. You were busy, and so was I. Life happens. Keanu watched from the doorway, his heart twisting at the intimate moment between the 2 sisters. He didn't step closer. He didn't want to intrude. He simply watched, silently supporting Sandra in the only way he knew, by giving her space while staying present. After a few minutes, the doctor entered the room. Sandra quickly wiped her tears and stood up, her posture straightening even though her emotions were still raw. She's stable, the doctor said. We're still running tests, but we believe she collapsed due to severe exhaustion and dehydration. She's been pushing herself too hard. Sandra closed her eyes briefly, guilt washing over her. She's always been stubborn, she murmured. The doctor nodded. She needs rest, and she needs support. She'll be all right, but it may take a little time. Sandra exhaled shakily. Relief flooded through her body, though the guilt didn't ease. When the doctor left and Leela drifted back into a light sleep, Sandra stepped out into the hallway, needing a moment to breathe. She leaned against the wall, closing her eyes as tears continued to slip down her cheeks. Keanu approached quietly, stopping in front of her. She's going to be okay, he said gently. Sandra nodded, but her voice broke when she answered. I should have been there for her. I should have known something was wrong. Keanu shook his head softly. You can't carry everything alone. You love her. She knows that. Sandra wiped her tears again, though they kept coming. I hate feeling helpless. You're not helpless, Keanu said. You showed up. That's what matters right now. She looked up at him, her eyes red but filled with gratitude. Thank you for coming with me. You don't need to thank me, he said softly. I wanted to be here. A long silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was heavy with emotion, fear, gratitude, and something else. something neither of them fully understood yet, but both felt growing stronger. After a moment, Sandra whispered, "Yesterday, everything you said, I didn't have time to process any of it." Keanu nodded, his expression gentle. "I know, and you don't have to rush. Your sister comes first." She looked at him, torn between gratitude and emotional confusion. "I don't want you to think I'm avoiding it." "I don't," he said simply. She studied him, noticing the sincerity in his eyes, the quiet strength he carried, the humility that made him feel safe even in moments of emotional chaos. She began slowly. "I need time, not because I don't feel anything, but because I feel too much." Those words hit Keanu deeper than anything she had said so far. "Take all the time you need," he whispered. She nodded, her chest tightening. "But I don't want you to disappear." He shook his head gently. "I won't." She let out a shaky breath of relief. And for the first time that day, she stepped closer and wrapped her arms around him. Keanu froze, surprised, but only for a moment. Then he held her gently, carefully, like she was something precious he was afraid to break. She buried her face against his shoulder, trembling with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered again. Keanu closed his eyes, feeling her pain, her warmth, her trust, and the growing depth of something he was no longer afraid to admit. When she finally pulled back, she looked into his eyes with a quiet intensity. "I don't know where this is going," she said softly, "but I don't want it to end." Keanu's breath caught. Right as he opened his mouth to respond, Leela's monitor inside the room beeped loudly. Sandra spun around, panic returning instantly. And everything in the hallway shifted into chaos once again, the night that tested everything. The loud, sudden beeping from the monitor sliced through the hallway like a knife. Sandra's heart lurched so violently that she couldn't breathe for a moment. She rushed back into the room before her mind could even process the fear crashing through her. Keanu followed immediately, his footsteps quick, his face tightening when he saw the flashing light on the monitor. Leela's chest was rising too fast, her breath shallow and unsteady, her eyebrows scrunched in pain. The nurse ran in within seconds, adjusting wires and checking the readings on the screen. The doctor followed shortly after, his expression serious but controlled. "What's happening?" Sandra cried, her voice trembling so hard she could barely speak. She moved to the bedside, squeezing Leela's hand as if her grip alone could hold her sister safely in place. "Her heart rate spiked," the nurse explained quickly. "We need to stabilize her." Sandra felt tears threaten again, but she forced herself not to break. She leaned closer to Leela, whispering desperately, "I'm here. I'm right here. Don't get scared. Please don't get scared." The doctor worked efficiently, adjusting medication, checking the monitors, giving instructions with calm authority. Leela winced softly, her breath shaking, but the beeping slowly began to settle. The sharp alarm softened into a steady rhythm again. After several tense minutes, the danger faded. The doctor finally stepped back, exhaling. "All right," he said gently. "She's okay. Her heart rate just responded to stress. When she wakes up fully, we'll talk to her about what she's been dealing with, but right now she's stable again." Sandra nodded, tears streaming down her face as she brushed hair off Leela's forehead. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The doctor placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before leaving the room. When the staff finally stepped out, Sandra slumped into the chair beside the bed, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against Leela's hand, her entire body trembling from the emotional shock. Keanu stood quietly near the foot of the bed, giving Sandra space while still being close enough to support her if she needed anything. The tension in his expression slowly softened when he saw that Leela was breathing steadily again. He watched Sandra's shoulders shake, and his heart broke for her. He wanted nothing more than to take away her fear, but he knew this was something only time could heal. Several minutes passed before Sandra finally lifted her head slightly, wiping her tears with the back of her hand, though they kept falling. "This is all my fault," she whispered, her voice tight with guilt. Keanu immediately stepped closer. "No, Sandra, it's not." She shook her head, staring at her sister's pale face. "If I had checked in, if I hadn't avoided our argument, maybe she wouldn't have pushed herself so hard. Maybe she would have told me she wasn't okay." "You can't control everything," Keanu said gently. "Sometimes people hide their struggles even from the ones they love." Sandra breathed shakily. "I should have known." He crouched down beside her so their eyes were level. You're human. You love her. You showed up the moment you heard. That matters more than anything that happened before. Sandra closed her eyes tightly, a soft sob escaping her throat. Keanu felt his chest ache. He reached out and gently placed a hand over hers, grounding her, reminding her she wasn't alone. She didn't pull away. The room grew quieter as the minutes passed. The monitor beeped steadily, the fluorescent lights above hummed softly, and the weight of the earlier panic slowly faded into a heavy exhaustion. Sandra leaned back in the chair, her body drained and her mind lost between fear and relief. You should go home, she whispered eventually. You've been here for hours. Keanu shook his head. I'm staying with you. Sandra looked at him, her eyes swollen from crying. You don't have to. I know, he replied softly, but I want to. Her throat tightened as she stared at him. Even after everything she had thrown into the air, the confusion, the emotional storm, the unexpected presence of her ex, the uncertainty of her own feelings, he remained by her side with a patience she didn't think anyone was capable of. You're going to be exhausted, she whispered. I've been exhausted before, he said gently, almost with a faint smile. But I've never regretted being there for someone who matters. Her breath caught. She looked at him for a long time, long enough to feel something shift inside her chest. But before she could respond, Leela stirred slightly, letting out a small groan. Sandra wiped her face quickly and leaned forward. Leela, she whispered. Leela's eyelids fluttered, but she didn't wake fully. She only shifted a little, as if sensing that someone she loved was nearby. Sandra brushed her fingers along her sister's arm softly. I'm here. I'm not leaving. Keanu watched them silently, his heart warming at the sight. He had always admired Sandra's strength, but seeing her now, raw, vulnerable, unwavering in her love, made him admire her even more. After a while, Sandra stood up and stepped into the hallway to get some air. Keanu followed her, worried she might fall apart again if she was alone. The hallway was dim and quiet, empty except for the soft glow of lights reflecting off the polished floor. Sandra leaned against the wall, sliding down slowly until she sat on the cold tile, pulling her knees close to her chest. She rested her forehead on them and took several shaky breaths. Keanu lowered himself to sit beside her, leaving just enough space so she didn't feel crowded but close enough that she could reach for him if she needed comfort. They sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Sandra lifted her head slightly. You must think I'm falling apart, she said in a broken whisper. Keanu shook his head. I think you're human. She let out a trembling sigh. I hate not being in control. No one is always in control, he said softly. Not even you. She turned to look at him, her expression fragile. Yesterday you told me something big, something that changed everything. And then today this happened. I feel like the universe is pulling me in different directions at once. He nodded slowly. I know the feeling. Sandra stared at him, searching his eyes. Are you okay? I haven't even asked. I've been so overwhelmed. I'm fine, he said gently. You're dealing with something real, that comes first. She shook her head. Today must have been awful for you too. I didn't even tell you Michael would be there. I didn't mean for you to walk into that. Keanu sighed softly. Michael isn't the problem. Your past is part of who you are. I don't expect you to hide anything. Her eyes softened, but it hurt you. He hesitated, just long enough for her to see the truth. She leaned closer just a little. Keanu, I don't want to hurt you. He gave her a small, tired smile. I know. She rubbed her forehead. Yesterday you told me how you felt, and it shook me. Not because it was bad, it was just real, and I didn't know if I was ready to face that. He nodded quietly. Take whatever time you need. She looked down at her hands. But today, seeing you here, sitting with me for hours, caring about Leela even though you barely know her, it means something. Keanu's breath caught slightly. Sandra. I'm not ready to say everything yet, she interrupted softly. But I feel something too, something I've been ignoring for a long time. Keanu's chest tightened in a mixture of hope and fear. You don't have to say anything you're not ready to say. I know, she whispered, but I don't want you to think I don't feel anything, because I do. I just need space to understand it. Keanu nodded. I'll give you all the space you need. She stared at him for a long time, her eyes softening again. You're good, she whispered. You're so good it scares me. Keanu lowered his gaze. I'm not perfect. You don't have to be, she said. You make everything feel calm, even today. He didn't know how to respond, so he said nothing. Instead, he let the silence between them settle into something warm, something honest. After a minute, Sandra rested her head gently on his shoulder. Keanu froze for a second, not because he didn't want it, but because the moment felt fragile, sacred, something he didn't want to break. But then he relaxed, letting her lean on him, letting himself be someone she could depend on without expectation. They sat like that in the quiet hallway, two people who had spent years circling around an unspoken truth, now finally sitting close enough to feel what words still struggled to express. After a long moment, Sandra whispered, "Promise me something." Keanu turned his head slightly. "Anything." Her voice trembled. "Don't walk away from me, even if I'm slow, even if I'm confused." He felt emotion swell in his chest. "I'm not going anywhere." Sandra closed her eyes. Right then, a nurse walked over quietly. "Excuse me," she said gently. "Are you Sandra Bullock?" Sandra quickly wiped her face and stood. "Yes, is she okay?" The nurse smiled softly. "She's awake now, and she's asking for you." Sandra's eyes widened. "I'll be right there." But before she walked away, the nurse added something unexpected. "She said she wants to speak with both of you." Sandra froze. Keanu blinked in surprise. The nurse nodded. "She asked for you by name, both of you." Sandra stared at Keanu, her heart dropping into her stomach. Whatever Leela wanted to say. It was something big, the truth she had been waiting to hear. Sandra felt her entire body tense when the nurse said her sister wanted to speak to both of them. She exchanged a glance with Keanu, her heart pounding, her thoughts spinning in 100 different directions at once. Leela had always been perceptive, always able to read between people's emotions, always able to see connections no one else noticed. If she asked for both of them, it meant she had already sensed something long before Sandra fully understood it herself. The hallway felt unbearably quiet as Sandra walked toward Leela's room with Keanu beside her. Her legs felt like they were made of stone, heavy with fear, guilt, and something else, anticipation. Keanu stayed close, not touching her, but offering a presence steady enough that she felt she could breathe. He didn't know what Leela wanted to say either, but he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on Sandra, and that alone made him more protective than he had ever been. When they reached the doorway, Sandra hesitated. Keanu noticed and leaned slightly closer, his voice a soft whisper. "You ready?" She shook her head. "No, but I have to be." He nodded, understanding more than she said. Sandra stepped inside. Leela lay awake now, her eyes tired but alert, her breathing still shallow but steady. The room felt calmer than before. The monitor beeped rhythmically, a quiet reassurance that she was still fighting, still here. When Leela saw Sandra, her face brightened with a faint smile, small, fragile, but real. "Hey," Leela whispered. Sandra rushed to her side and gently took her hand. "Hey," she whispered back, tears immediately filling her eyes again. "You scared me." Leela squeezed her sister's hand softly. "Sorry about that. I wasn't trying to be dramatic." Sandra let out a shaky laugh, wiping her tears even as they fell. "This is not funny." "A little," Leela murmured, then her eyes shifted toward Keanu. "And you come in, I meant you too." Keanu stepped forward, a little unsure, offering a humble nod as he approached. "Hi, Leela, it's good to see you awake." Leela smiled faintly. "I'm glad you're here, both of you." Sandra glanced between them nervously. "Leela, what's going on? What do you want to talk about?" Leela took a slow breath, her expression turning serious in a way that made Sandra's heart race again. She looked at Keanu first. "Thank you for being here," she said gently. "I know you didn't have to stay." Keanu shook his head. "I wanted to." Leela nodded knowingly, then looked at Sandra. Her eyes softened, filling with a mixture of love and concern. "San, you've always been strong," she whispered, "but you're also really good at running away from things that scare you." Sandra stiffened. "I'm not." Leela raised an eyebrow. Even weak, she could still silence her sister with a single look. "Please don't lie to me, not today." Sandra sighed, her throat tightening. I've had a lot going on." "I know," Leela said gently. "I know more than you think." Sandra's stomach twisted. Leela turned her head toward Keanu. "And you've been carrying something for a long time too, haven't you?" Keanu froze, his breath catching for a moment. He didn't answer with words, but the silence in his eyes was enough. Leela nodded slowly. I knew it. I could always see the way you looked at her, even years ago, and I saw the way she talked about you too, even when she pretended it wasn't important. Keanu glanced at Sandra, but she looked away, overwhelmed. Leela squeezed Sandra's hand again. You push away the things that feel too deep because you're afraid they'll break you. But look at me, San, life is short, too short. You don't get forever to fix things. You don't get forever to keep waiting. Sandra felt tears rising again. I know. No, Leela whispered. I don't think you do. I think you've been so busy surviving, protecting yourself, climbing through your own storms that you forgot something very simple. She paused, her breath shaky. You deserve love too. Sandra's eyes filled completely, tears spilling over. Keanu stood still near the foot of the bed, his chest tightening at the raw emotion unfolding between the sisters. He felt like an outsider to their bond, yet also deeply connected to them in a way he couldn't explain. Leela's words struck him too, not because they were meant for him, but because he had lived his own life in quiet survival, carrying grief, carrying loneliness, carrying an unspoken hope he thought he would never dare to voice. Leela turned her gaze to Keanu again. And you, she whispered, don't hide anymore. She needs people who tell the truth, even when it scares her. Keanu nodded slowly, gently. I understand. But Leela wasn't finished. She inhaled deeply, too deeply, as if the effort itself cost her pain. The two of you can pretend it's timing, you can pretend it's distance, you can pretend it's work or life or fear, but I see the way you look at each other. I saw it the moment I opened my eyes. Sandra lowered her head, tears falling freely. Keanu swallowed hard, his own emotions rising, though he held them tightly, respectfully. Leela continued, her voice soft but firm. If you let this go because you're scared, you'll regret it for the rest of your lives. I promise you that. Sandra's hand trembled in hers. Leela. Don't run from love, Leela whispered. Not when it's standing right in front of you, not when it's been waiting for years. The room grew quiet. Deeply, painfully quiet. Sandra finally looked up at Keanu, her face streaked with tears, her expression wide open, vulnerable in a way she almost never allowed. He stared back at her, his heart pounding, his breath unsteady, his entire being pulled toward her by something he had spent years trying to silence. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't look away. Leela relaxed back into her pillow, her voice softening with exhaustion. I'm tired, she whispered. But I needed to say that because I want my sister to be happy, and I think maybe she already found someone who makes her feel safe. Sandra's breath caught. Keanu lowered his gaze, humbled and overwhelmed. The nurse entered again after a few minutes, wanting to run another test. Leela needed rest, so Sandra and Keanu stepped out of the room. But the air outside felt different now. Lighter, heavier, brighter, darker, all at once. Sandra leaned against the wall, her hands shaking as she wiped her face. Keanu approached slowly. How are you feeling? He asked gently. She let out a shaky breath, exposed, terrified, relieved all at once. He nodded softly. I can understand that. She looked at him, her voice trembling. Leela's right. I do run from things that feel too real. I always have. Keanu didn't comment. He didn't need to. Sandra continued, her voice almost a whisper. Yesterday, after you told me how you felt, I didn't run because I didn't feel something. I ran because I did, and it scared me. Keanu's breath stopped in his chest. Sandra wiped her tears, her hands still unsteady. I never said anything all those years ago because I thought if we tried something and it fell apart, we'd ruin something good, something rare. I didn't want to lose you. He felt something warm and painful rise in his chest. You wouldn't have lost me. She shook her head softly. I didn't know that then. I didn't know how gentle you could be, how patient, how steady. I didn't know you'd show up like this when everything was falling apart. I didn't know you could make a moment like this feel less terrifying. Keanu stepped closer, slowly, respectfully. Sandra, he whispered, I'm here because I care, because I've always cared, not because I expect anything from you. Her eyes softened, but I want you to. Keanu froze. Sandra took a breath, steadying herself. I don't know what happens next, she said. I don't know what this looks like. I don't know if I'm ready for everything, but I don't want to run anymore, not from you. Keanu's throat tightened as emotion flooded him. He wanted to speak but couldn't find the right words. So instead, he did the gentlest thing he could. He stepped close enough for her to feel his warmth, and he held out his hand. An invitation. Not a demand. Not a claim. Just a quiet offering. Sandra stared at his open hand for a long moment, tears welling again. Her breath trembled. Then slowly, carefully, she placed her hand in his. It fit so naturally that she felt her heart crack open in relief. Keanu closed his fingers around hers, holding her gently, as if she were something soft and fragile he had waited years to touch without fear. She stepped into him, resting her forehead gently against his chest. He wrapped an arm around her, not tightly, but with a steady warmth that told her she was safe. They stood like that in the dim hallway of a quiet hospital, two people who had walked through years of unspoken emotion, finally allowing themselves to stop running. Finally choosing to stay. After several minutes, Sandra whispered into his shirt, "We'll take it slow, okay?" Keanu nodded, his voice soft, "As slow as you need." She tightened her hand in his, "But don't let go." "I won't," he whispered. And he didn't. Not then. Not later. Not ever again. Because sometimes life circles back to the people who were meant to find each other. Not through dramatic fate, not through perfect timing, but through honesty, patience, kindness, and the courage to stop running. And as Sandra and Keanu walked back into Leela's room, still holding hands, a quiet, fragile hope followed them. One that neither of them was afraid of anymore.